She had been called worse. That was the part nobody wanted to hear, because it complicated the story, made it harder to package into something clean and shareable. But it was true. Vanessa Peterson had been called worse than trash. She had been called worse by better people, in better rooms, with better vocabularies. The word itself was not the wound. The wound was the casualness of it. The way it left his mouth like he was commenting on the weather. She was 31 years old the first time it happened. Sitting in her car outside the public defender's office where she worked 60 hours a week for a salary that barely covered her student loans and her mother's medication. The officer had approached her window the way certain men approach things they have already decided about. Shoulders first. Chin up. The conclusion written before the conversation began. He wanted her plates. Then her license. Then he wanted to know what she was doing parked on this particular street, in front of this particular building, as though the combination of her face and her presence in that zip code required explanation. She gave him everything he asked for. Calmly. Completely. He handed her documents back and said something to his partner. His partner was already walking away, already bored, and the officer said it to the retreating back of a man who wasn't really listening. But she heard it. She was supposed to hear it. That was the point of saying it at a volume and distance carefully calculated to be almost private. Almost. Trash. Not a shout. Not a confrontation. Just a word dropped like a cigarette butt. Casually. Completely without concern for where it landed. Vanessa sat in her car for a long time after they drove away. She did not cry. She thought about crying, assessed it the way she assessed most things, and decided it was not a productive use of the next 10 minutes. She had a bail hearing at 2. She had a client who was 19 years old and terrified and needed her to walk into that room with everything she had. She went inside. She did the hearing. Her client went home that night instead of staying in a cell. She drove home in her own car, on her own streets, and did not think about the officer again. Or she tried not to. The body keeps its own records, separate from what the mind decides. She would learn that later. She was still young enough then to believe that moving forward and leaving behind were the same thing. They are not. 12 years pass the way years pass when a person is working too hard to notice them going. One case became 50, became 500. The public defender's office became a law firm, small and scrappy, the kind that took cases other firms found inconvenient. The law firm became a reputation. The reputation became something that reached the people who appoint judges in the state of Georgia, and one of those people made a phone call, and the phone call became a conversation, and the conversation became an appointment, and the appointment became the day Vanessa Peterson sat in a chair and was sworn in and became, officially, irrevocably, the thing she had been building toward since she was 8 years old, watching her grandmother argue with a landlord and understanding for the first time that the world had rules and that knowing the rules was a form of power. Judge Peterson. She bought a house the same year. Nothing large. A brick house on a quiet street with a magnolia tree in the front yard that bloomed every April whether she remembered to take care of it or not. She liked that about the tree. Its indifference to her attention. Its commitment to blooming on schedule regardless of what was happening inside the house. Her mother came to stay with her the following spring. Her mother, who had worked double shifts at a textile plant for 22 years and never once said that the work was beneath her, who had saved enough to send Vanessa to a state school and told her every single morning before she left the house, "You are going to walk into rooms that were not built for you, and you are going to walk in anyway, and you are going to be better than they expect, not for them, never for them, but because that is who we are." Vanessa thought about her mother most mornings when she put on her robes. Not in a sentimental way. In a practical one. The robes had weight. She wanted to wear them correctly. The morning it happened was a Tuesday in October. Tuesdays were arraignment days, which meant the docket was long and the room cycled through cases at a pace that left very little room for theatrics. Vanessa liked arraignment Tuesdays for exactly this reason. The work was clear. Move the cases. Set the terms. Keep things moving. There was a particular satisfaction in the efficiency of it, the way a well-run courtroom felt like a well-tuned instrument. She was reviewing the morning's docket when her clerk mentioned there were several officer testimonies scheduled, 2 cases requiring the arresting officers to be present for procedural confirmation. Standard. Unremarkable. Officers came through her courtroom regularly, and she treated them the way she treated everyone who stood in her courtroom, with the full, undivided attention of someone who had been given authority specifically to be fair. She did not carry grudges into her courtroom. This was not a noble sentiment. It was a professional requirement she took seriously. A courtroom where the judge carried personal history was a courtroom with a cracked foundation, and Vanessa Peterson had not spent 12 years building her career on something she intended to crack. The morning moved through its cases. She was halfway through the docket when the doors opened. He came in with the particular walk of a man in uniform who is comfortable in institutional spaces, which made sense because courtrooms and precincts shared a certain grammar, a certain arrangement of authority and procedure that people inside the system moved through with ease. He was in his 40s now. Heavier than he had been. The same chin-up posture. She recognized him in the way you recognize a piece of music you haven't heard in years. Not the title first. The feeling first. A small, very quiet thing that shifted in her chest, settled, and went still. She watched him find his seat. She watched him orient himself the way everyone did when they entered the courtroom for the first time, the instinctive scan of the room, the confirmation of where power lived, the eyes moving to the elevated bench, the seal, the flag, the person in the robes. She watched him see her. The room was doing its ordinary business around them. Her clerk was shuffling papers. The bailiff was standing near the door. A defense attorney was whispering something to her client in the second row. The room was full of people doing the small necessary tasks that keep the machinery of a proceeding moving. She let the silence run one beat longer than necessary. Then she called the next case. His name was Officer Dale Briggs. She knew this because it was on the docket, because he was there as the arresting officer in a straightforward possession case, because the paperwork was routine and his presence was procedural and nothing about the morning required anything from her except the application of law to the facts in front of her. She applied the law. He stood when addressed. He answered the questions put to him by the assistant district attorney. He was professional. He was composed. He said Your Honor with the automatic fluency of a man who had been in enough courtrooms to have the phrase in his muscle memory, not something he thought about, just the thing you said. She noted this. Not with satisfaction, exactly. With something more complicated and less comfortable than satisfaction. There was no version of this moment that felt like victory, because victory implied a competition, and she had not been competing with Dale Briggs. She had simply been living her life while he briefly intersected with it and left a mark he almost certainly did not remember leaving. This was the part of the story that was hard to explain to people who wanted it to be simpler. She was not waiting for him. She had not been waiting. The courtroom was hers because she had built it, piece by piece, year by year, with the kind of focused and relentless work that does not leave much room for waiting. She had not imagined this moment, or rehearsed a speech for it, or pictured the expression on his face when he realized who she was. She had been too busy for any of that. And yet, the body keeps its own records. She felt, somewhere beneath the professional composure, beneath the robes and the docket and the efficient machinery of the morning, something very quiet and very old shift and settle. Like a door that had been standing slightly open for 12 years finally deciding, without drama, to close. She did not confront him. This disappointed the people who heard the story later, who wanted a dramatic exchange, something quotable, a line that could be put in bold and shared. They wanted her to lean over the bench and say something perfectly calibrated to make him understand the full weight of what he had done in a parking lot in front of a building on an ordinary afternoon 12 years ago. She did not. Partly because it would have been a misuse of her courtroom and her authority, and she was deeply serious about both. Partly because she had long ago learned that the desire to make someone understand what they have done to you is a trap, because understanding requires their participation, and their participation is the one thing you cannot compel. But mostly because she did not need it. She had discovered, over 12 years of standing in rooms that had not been built for her and walking in any way, that there was a specific kind of power in simply being undeniable. You could not argue with her presence. You could not talk over her record. You could not dismiss what was sitting 12 feet above you on an elevated bench, wearing robes, holding a gavel, running the room. She did not need him to understand. She needed to do her job. She did her job. The case was resolved in 11 minutes. Standard timeline for a straightforward arraignment. Dale Briggs gathered his folder, stood when the judge indicated the proceeding was concluded, and moved toward the exit with the same confident walk he had carried in. At the door, he paused. She was already reviewing the next file, her pen moving across the margin of the docket, her clerk sliding her the next set of papers. The room was resetting itself for the following case with the brisk efficiency she required. He looked back once. Whether he remembered, she never knew. She did not look up in time to read his face, and she told herself this was because she was reading the next file, which was true. It was true, and it was also possible that she did not look up on purpose, because she had decided, somewhere in the 12 years between a parking lot and a courtroom, that his memory of her was simply not a thing that mattered. What mattered was the next case. She called it. The room moved forward. She told her mother about it that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea that were both getting cold because they kept talking instead of drinking. Her mother listened the way she always listened, with complete attention and no interruption, and when Vanessa finished, her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did it feel like anything?" Vanessa thought about this seriously, the way she thought about most things. "Yes," she said. "But not what I expected." Her mother nodded like this was exactly the right answer, like she had been waiting for precisely this response, and picked up her tea. They talked about other things after that. Her mother's doctor's appointment. The magnolia tree, which had dropped its last blooms of the season and was now standing bare and patient in the front yard, already preparing for April. A neighbor's new dog, which barked at nothing every morning at 6 and which Vanessa had decided to find charming rather than annoying because she had enough things in her life that required genuine irritation, and a confused dog did not need to be one of them. At 9 o'clock her mother went to bed and Vanessa sat alone in the kitchen with the last cold inch of her tea. She thought about the 19-year-old she had gotten released on bail 22 years ago, on a Tuesday afternoon after a long morning that had started with a parking lot and a word dropped like a cigarette butt. She wondered sometimes where he had ended up. She hoped somewhere good. She had no way of knowing. She washed the cups. She went to bed. She had a full docket in the morning. The story got out the way stories get out, through the particular network of people who are connected to courtrooms and precincts and city halls, the ecosystem of people who talk to each other at the edges of official proceedings. Someone who had been in the courtroom that Tuesday mentioned it to someone else. That someone else mentioned it to a journalist who wrote a short piece that was shared widely because it was the kind of story the internet loves, clean, satisfying, shaped like justice. The piece described a dramatic confrontation. A pointed exchange. A moment of public reckoning that had never actually happened. Vanessa read it over breakfast. She put her phone down. She went to work. Later, a reporter called the courthouse asking for a comment. Her clerk, who had been with her for 6 years and understood exactly how she operated, told the reporter that Judge Peterson did not comment on individual proceedings and was currently on the bench. Both of these things were true. The reporter published the piece anyway, with the line, "Judge Peterson could not be reached for comment." This was also true, and she found, when she read it, that she did not mind the way it sounded. Like a woman too busy to be reached. Like a woman with a courtroom to run. Which was exactly what she was. The magnolia bloomed the following April, on schedule, without her help. She was standing at the kitchen window with her first cup of coffee when she noticed it, the white flowers opening against the bare branches with the same absolute commitment they brought every year, the same reliability, the same complete indifference to whether anyone was watching. She had been called trash by a man who had not known her name. She had spent 12 years becoming undeniable. Neither of these things canceled the other out. Both of them were true simultaneously, and she had learned, slowly and with some difficulty, to hold both truths in the same hand without needing one of them to win. The world had rules. Knowing the rules was a form of power. She had known this since she was 8 years old, watching her grandmother argue with a landlord on a hot afternoon, and she knew it now, standing in her own kitchen, in her own house, looking at her own tree doing the only thing it knew how to do. Bloom. Regardless. On schedule. She finished her coffee. She put on her robes. She went to work.